last night, one of my top China sources reached out to me. My source listens to the podcast, and my source wants correct information. My source specifically told me to give you guys this information. He wants accurate information and transparency for China. My source is from the West, but my source has lived in China for over a decade and has extensive contacts all throughout China. I won't say which city my source lives in. So, my source told me in great detail that the food crisis in China is far worse than is being reported by the mainstream media. Far worse. So before I get into and read some of the specific comments from my source for you guys, let me talk about what the media is telling us right now about the food crisis. And this also has to do with the trade war. This also has to do with the dollar shortage, and the Chinese Communist Party and other parts of the Chinese economy have not done a good job stockpiling food commodities. They were caught very off guard with the Trump trade war, with how Trump has escalated things. So first, let me talk about the information that's out there in public. So as of right now, the information that was released last week with Chinese consumer price inflation says that food prices spiked 7.7% in the last year or so. Food prices rose 7.7% in May from a year ago, and almost all their CPI index rise is on food, and a lot of it's on the cost of pork. But I'll attach a link if you want to take a look at the CNBC interview, but it looks like most of the inflation increase as of right now is in pork. But this article is assuming that consumers will simply switch to other meat like chicken, beef, or it says button. I think they mean mutton or lamb. But this article is inaccurate, as my source told me yesterday. So as well, there's also the swine flu, which has caused a lot of damage to the pork industry in China. There's varying estimates about this. So according to Dutch agricultural lender Rabobank estimates that about 90 million pigs, which is more than the entire U.S. hog population, and the U.S.'s hog population is the second largest in the world behind China, that 90 million pigs in China, or about 20% of the nation's hog herd, has already been wiped out with African swine fever recently. So that is one estimate. I just saw that's a recent article from June as well. And I just saw another article from a couple weeks ago as well. And this article has different estimates in it. This one's even worse. So this article says that China's food supply is being imperiled as new reports warn that up to 50% of China's 440 million pigs are now at risk from African swine fever infection. The South China Morning Post reported that Chairman Chan Kin-yip of the Federation of Hong Kong Agricultural Associations claimed that Chinese mainland pig farmers told him African swine fever has spread to 30% of mainland pigs, while another Hong Kong pig farmer based in China told Yip the exposure rate is as high as 50%. So it looks like with 23.8 billion of agricultural imports from the U.S. in 2017, retaliatory tariffs directly aimed at President Trump's rural voter base were expected to be China's hammer to bludgeon the U.S. into abandoning its trade war. Accounting for 17% of U.S. agricultural exports, Chinese customers were number 1 in soybeans, number 2 in pork and hay, number 3 in dairy and poultry, number 4 in beef, and number 5 in wheat. But it looks like China lacks the dollars to import the food it needs. And there's also another article that came out this month about bird flu. So China also, and they've been doing gene editing, like CRISPR gene editing, and there's articles about that, but it looks like there's been a number of very serious bird flu outbreaks. I don't have the exact number. The estimates here are very, very widely, but it does look pretty serious with that. And one more article, and I will attach a link to you guys about this. And this is actually a good one from Washington Post. It's by Josh Rogan from Washington Post. Normally, Washington Post articles are pretty garbage and very politically biased. But this article is actually about China's infiltration of U.S. capital markets as a national security concern. And it talks about China's desperation to extort money out of American investors to get dollars, whether it's the Chinese Communist Party manipulating Morgan Stanley to get Chinese stocks included in the MSCI Emerging Markets Global Index stock ETF or the Global Bond Fund, that Michael Bloomberg. So China is in desperate need of dollars, and they are in desperate need of dollars to buy food and import food. Now that I've covered a lot of the mainstream stuff and a few other China sources, let me get to what my China source said. So my China source said that there are many key products that the prices have been frozen, subsidized, or state controlled. It's a long list, but he listed some of them. He says pork, soybeans, gasoline, cooking oil, school supplies, electricity, water, transportation, and many more. And with the African swine flu decimating Chinese pork supply, even if the average Chinese knew about the swine flu, they wouldn't care because the price of pork at the market, for the most part, hasn't changed in the last 2 years due to price controls, I guess. And remember, in the mainstream article from CNBC talking about the CPI increase, the 7.7% increase in food since May of last year, blaming most of it on pork prices and saying that the Chinese consumer will just switch to other meat, to chicken, beef, or mutton. This completely contradicts the mainstream coverage of that. And my China source says that chicken, beef, lamb, and other vegetables, the prices of those are going through the roof. And they don't know exactly when, but at some date there will be a breaking point with increasing prices and rising shortages of these items. So although it can't be admitted publicly, according to my source, China is desperate for a trade deal. If Trump had any sense, he would ask for way too much, knowing China couldn't accept it and prolong the trade war. So eventually China could potentially collapse when it can no longer feed its 1.4 billion people. So China is publicly, showing strength, saving face about the trade war, right? And the escalation that they're going to hold strong, they're going to fight back. But in reality, in private, China is getting hurt really, really badly by the trade war because they are not running those enormous trade surpluses with the US now to get massive amounts of dollars so they can go and buy all the food they need, all the energy they need. So they have not stockpiled food like they should have. And apparently, according to my source, that there's runaway food price inflation and looming massive shortages in a lot of food items in China. For the items I mentioned, specifically chicken, beef, lamb, and a number of important vegetables. Sounds like a lot of them. So the dollar shortage is really hitting them hard, and they cannot import many of the food items that they need. And this is why China is going to Russia, going to other countries with trade deals, because China is trying to get the energy, the oil, the natural gas, and also they're trying to get the food items imported without dollars. So I think this is really insightful about problems within China and this is number one priority for the Chinese Communist Party, is to maintain control and prevent civil and social unrest. And to do that, people have to have jobs in China, people have to have money in their pocket, and people have to have food. People have to be fed. So if people in China are used to getting a certain amount of protein now or a certain amount of vegetables, and all of a sudden it goes from a halfway decent meal to very, very little or almost nothing, there's going to be potentially revolt. People are going to get angry. So beneath the surface, things are much worse in China, and it starts with the food supply, according to my source. And my source, who is from the West and has lived in China for over a decade, is very, very worried about staying there. Probably wants to leave very, very soon. Just like a lot of other Westerners in China, who, whether it's Winston from Serpensa and ADV China, or Matt Lawai86 from ADV China, and then also the guy from Georges, the Frenchman, who had been in China for 13 or 14 years, China nonstop. He had to leave China. He was kicked out because they didn't like a YouTube video he made, so they reduced, even though he had a Chinese wife and kids who were Chinese, they kicked him out. He had 30 days to leave. So things are escalating beneath the surface. So that's all I wanted to cover for this short little podcast. And I want to thank my source. I know he listens to this. He wanted the information out there. With his permission, this information was shared so that you guys get the best information possible on China. And I will attach links to some of these other articles and studies, but my source seems to have his finger on the pulse of a lot of Chinese information with his contacts there. A lot of great contacts. I can't go into all the details, but a lot of great contacts there. And I have multiple sources in China now. So the trade war, to sum everything up, the trade war in China, the trade war between the US and China is really, really hurting the Chinese right now, especially with food. Especially with food prices, with chicken, beef, even pork now, although pork is subsidized from what it sounds like in China, and most Chinese don't know or care that there's this swine flu shortage that has potentially knocked out a lot of the pork population because the Chinese government is subsidizing the pork price. They're trying to, with a price control. And if you guys know economics, you know eventually with a price control, that means that the market is not going to respond to supply and demand properly, and there's eventually going to be shortages of pork. So either China will cave, and China will have to import soybeans, maybe from the US, and pork from the US, or China will have to negotiate a new type of deal for another source. But from what it sounds like with the pork market to raise hogs, there is not that type of supply available from any other country to meet China's demand besides the US. So there are normally these things are sophisticated to play these things for advanced traders, and it would require, futures contracts or stuff like that. So the average retail investor is probably, for a trading perspective, not going to be able to play this that much. But it sounds like if you're a more sophisticated investor, and again, this is not financial advice, you may want to look into maybe setting up some type of volatility trade with futures contracts or options on futures or something, because at some point, China's going to have to come into the market. If they can get dollars, and it looks like they're going to get trillions of dollars from that global bond index bailout that Michael Bloomberg is going to give the Chinese, where all these state-owned enterprise bonds are going into this global bond index fund, and then the money, the American investor money from like Vanguard and pension funds and all these other funds are going to be a lot of the average American investor doesn't know a lot about this, but their money is unwittingly, even if they support the trade war against China, their money is unwittingly going to be going into China and the Chinese government. So according to estimates from Kyle Bass and Emma Molman, who are very smart people, they've run the numbers, and I think other people have confirmed this, other China experts, other Westerners who are China experts, including Daniel Lacaille, that China is supposed to get about $3.3 trillion approximately in extra dollars from this global bond fund, which is a bailout. And I really don't like Michael Bloomberg. I think he's a sellout, a champagne socialist. Maybe the Chinese Communist Party has some dirt on him, and that's why he agreed to this. But it's not, it's sabotaging. I'm not in favor of the trade war. I don't like tariffs. I don't like trade war escalating. But if you are in favor of the trade war, it looks like Michael Bloomberg has agreed to help save the Chinese, at least temporarily, so they can buy food, with his inclusion of Chinese state-owned enterprise bonds in this global bond fund index, which is going to move American investor money, trillions of dollars of American investor money, from like Vanguard and BlackRock and some of these other larger money management firms that just buy the index and don't really do much if any due diligence into, and this is the problem with index fund investing, it's just about buying large blocks of stuff. And then the index just buys the most liquid stuff, and it doesn't really do due diligence. So I think that's a good summary to leave things at here in about 15 minutes of analysis for what my source just gave me, the new information. If anyone else has any other questions or comments, it'll be below the video afterwards. We can talk about this more. But China's dollar short, according to my source, China's dollar shortage is real. And there is a very accelerating and looming food crisis in China. And a lot of Chinese residents are starting to get really, really upset at how their food bills are going up, and it's threatening their standard of living. Okay, bye for now.